The small boy sat quietly in the corner of Hope Haven Foster Center's playroom, his dark eyes fixed on a worn-out teddy bear in his hands. For 6 long years, he hadn't spoken a single word. Not when the kind nurses brought him warm milk before bed. Not when other kids invited him to play with their colorful blocks. Not even when the gentle social workers showed him pictures of potential foster families. The staff called him Little Star because of the star-shaped birthmark near his wrist, and because, like the stars, he shone brightest in silence. His case file, thick as a phone book, sat heavy on Mrs. Lee's desk at the center. She would often open it late at night, trying to piece together the puzzle of this mysterious child who had captured everyone's heart. The story began on a chilly autumn morning 6 years ago. A park maintenance worker found a 3-year-old boy sleeping under a big oak tree, clutching nothing but a small backpack with a change of clothes and a note that simply read, "Please take care of him." No name. No date. No explanation of why a toddler was left alone in the world. The police searched for weeks. They checked security cameras, interviewed locals, and posted pictures all over the city. But it was like the boy had appeared out of thin air. The only clue to his past was a unique dragon design on his backpack, but even that led nowhere. At first, everyone thought he was just scared. Who wouldn't be? Child psychologists visited regularly, bringing toys and books, trying to coax words from his sealed lips. They used puppets, music, and even brought in therapy dogs. The little boy would smile sometimes, pet the dogs, and even laugh silently, but words remained locked away in his heart. Mrs. Lee remembered the day they discovered his love for drawing. It happened by accident when someone left crayons and paper near his favorite corner. His pictures told stories that his voice couldn't. Colorful scenes of parks, trees, and sometimes a woman with long dark hair whose face was always turned away. The social workers kept every drawing, hoping they might someday help unlock the mystery of his past. The other children at Hope Haven were curious about their silent friend. Some tried to teach him their games, while others made up stories about why he didn't speak. Maybe he's a superhero keeping a big secret, one little girl suggested. Or perhaps he made a wish with a magical creature to trade his voice for something special, another boy whispered during nap time. Despite his silence, the boy had a way of communicating that went beyond words. He could tell when someone was sad and would quietly offer his teddy bear as comfort. During thunderstorms, he would help the younger kids feel brave by acting out funny shadow puppet shows on the walls. And whenever new children arrived at the center, crying and scared, he would share his special corner with them until they felt better. The doctors had big words for his condition: selective mutism, post-traumatic stress, attachment disorder. But Mrs. Lee knew better than to put him in any box. Some feelings are too big for words, she would tell worried visitors. When he's ready, when he feels safe enough, we'll find his voice again. As months turned into years, something remarkable happened. While the boy remained silent, he began to create his own special language. A tilt of his head meant thank you. A quick tap on someone's shoulder was his way of saying, "Look at this." And when he was really happy, his whole face would light up in a way that spoke louder than any words could. Nobody at Hope Haven could have guessed that this quiet child would one day stand in a courtroom and change everything with just one word. But that's the thing about silence. Sometimes it's just waiting for the perfect moment to break. The couple sat nervously in Mrs. Lee's office, flipping through folders of children needing homes. They had done this before, opened their hearts and home to 3 foster children over the years. Each time was special, each child unique. But something felt different today. "Wait," the wife whispered, touching a photo of the silent boy. He was sitting cross-legged in the center's garden, surrounded by butterflies, with the hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Can you tell us more about him?" Mrs. Lee took a deep breath. She had shown his file to dozens of couples before, and each time, the words selective mutism and attachment issues had made them turn the page. But there was something in this couple's eyes, a gentle understanding that went beyond words. "He's been with us for 6 years," Mrs. Lee explained, watching their faces carefully. "He hasn't spoken since the day he was found, but don't let his silence fool you. He has the biggest heart I've ever seen in a child." The husband leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Does he communicate at all?" Mrs. Lee smiled, pulling out a folder filled with colorful drawings. "In his own way. These are his stories. See how he captures emotions in these pictures. And watch this." She walked to her office door and waved at the boy, who was reading in his usual corner. His face lit up, and he waved back with a gentle motion that seemed to carry all the warmth in the world. Their teenage daughter, who had come along for this visit, was already walking toward him. She had copper-red hair tied in a messy bun and paint stains on her jeans from her art classes. The couple watched, hearts in their throats, as she sat down next to the boy. Instead of trying to make him talk, like most people did, she simply pulled out her sketchbook and started drawing. The boy peered over, curious. Soon, they were drawing together, creating a shared story on paper without exchanging a single word. "She's always been different," the mother explained, wiping away a tear. "Born with partial hearing loss, she learned to read the world through other senses. Maybe that's why." They visited every day for 2 weeks. Each time, they learned something new about the quiet boy. How he loved the color blue. How he would leave half his cookie at lunch for the birds in the garden. How he had a special way of comforting the younger children when they were upset, simply by being present. The couple brought simple gifts: art supplies, picture books, and once, a star projector that turned his corner of the dormitory into a galaxy at night. The other children would gather around, making wishes on his projected stars, while he sat in the middle, eyes twinkling with joy. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments of uncertainty, like when he had his first nightmare during their trial overnight stay. Instead of running away scared, the couple sat with him until dawn, the husband softly playing his guitar while the wife created shadow puppets on the wall. Their daughter invented a simple sign language on the spot. Tapping her heart meant, "You're safe." Touching her palm to his meant, "We're here." Some people questioned their decision. "Are you sure?" their friends would ask. Taking in a child who doesn't speak, it could be challenging. But the couple had learned something important over their years of fostering. Sometimes the biggest challenges brought the greatest joys. When they finally brought him home, they didn't try to make him talk. Instead, they let him explore at his own pace. The daughter covered one wall of his new room with paper, creating a giant canvas where they could draw together. The husband built a reading nook by the window, filled with soft pillows and twinkling lights. The wife learned to read his subtle expressions. How his eyebrows would scrunch when he was thinking hard. How his fingers would dance when he was excited. Little did they know that this quiet beginning would lead to one of the most powerful moments in their lives, right in the middle of a busy courtroom. But for now, they were content in their growing language of silence, building trust one gentle moment at a time. 8 months can feel like forever or past in the blink of an eye. For this family, every day brought tiny miracles that might have seemed ordinary to others, but to them meant the world. It started with breakfast. The quiet boy, who used to eat alone at the foster center, began waiting for everyone before taking his first bite. He would carefully arrange 4 plates, 4 cups, and 4 napkins, making sure everything was perfect. If someone was running late, he'd sit patiently, hands folded in his lap, until the whole family was together. The daughter noticed it first, how he started copying her morning routine. When she brushed her teeth, he would mirror her movements exactly, down to the way she counted each brush stroke by tapping her foot. Their bathroom mirror became a silent stage for funny faces and exaggerated expressions that often ended in quiet giggles. One rainy Tuesday, the wife found a sticky note on her coffee mug. A simple drawing of a sun, clearly done by small hands, brightened her morning more than any amount of caffeine could have. After that, These little drawings started appearing everywhere, on lunchboxes, tucked into coat pockets, even stuck to the dog's water bowl. The husband's guitar became a bridge between their worlds. Though the boy never sang along, he would sit for hours watching those weathered hands move across the strings. Soon, he started tapping rhythms on his knees, creating his own silent music that somehow perfectly matched whatever song was being played. Their old golden retriever, who had seen other foster children come and go, took on the role of translator. The boy and the dog developed their own communication system. 2 pats meant, "Let's play." 3 meant, "I need a hug." And a gentle head bump against the leg became their special way of saying, "I love you." School was a different kind of challenge. The teachers were understanding but concerned. How would a child who didn't speak complete his oral presentations? The answer came in unexpected ways. For his science project about the solar system, the boy created an entire miniature universe that moved and spun, telling its story without words. His classmates were so impressed that they voted it Most Creative Project of the Year. At home, the family's sign language grew more sophisticated. The daughter's simple gestures evolved into a complex system that only they understood. A wiggle of fingers meant, "Pass the salt." But that same wiggle near the eyes meant, "I saw something funny today." They could have entire conversations across a crowded room without making a sound. The breakthrough moments were subtle but meaningful. Like the morning he started making his own bed without being asked. Or the afternoon he helped the younger kids in his class tie their shoelaces during gym time. Each small action spoke volumes about the trust he was building, not just with his new family, but with the world around him. Some evenings, they would all sit in his reading nook, now decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars that matched the real constellations outside. The daughter would read stories aloud while he followed along, his finger tracing each word carefully. Sometimes, his lips would move silently, as if practicing in secret. But not everyone understood their joy in these small victories. Extended family members would visit and ask uncomfortable questions. "Has he started talking yet?" They'd whisper, as if silence was a problem that needed fixing. The parents would just smile and say, "He talks all the time. You just have to know how to listen." One particularly special moment came during a weekend trip to the beach. As waves crashed against the shore, the boy stood at the water's edge, arms spread wide. For the first time, they heard him laugh. A real, full-bodied laugh that carried across the sand and made strangers turn and smile. It wasn't words, but it was music. Nobody realized then that this period of quiet growth was setting the stage for something extraordinary. Like a flower preparing to bloom, the boy was gathering his strength, finding his own way to show the world who he really was. And when he finally did speak, it would be at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place, with exactly the right word. The adoption paperwork sat on the kitchen table like a mountain waiting to be climbed. The parents spent their evenings filling out form after form, their coffee growing cold as they carefully documented every detail of their life together. Each page felt like both a promise and a prayer. Their living room had become command central, with color-coded folders spread across every surface. Blue folders held medical records, pediatrician visits showing perfect health but persistent silence. Green folders contained school reports that told a remarkable story: top grades in math, outstanding art projects, and a special note from the music teacher about how the boy could feel rhythm in a way few children could. The social worker who visited monthly couldn't help but smile at the changes in their home. The walls that were once bare now displayed a gallery of artwork, collaborative pieces where the daughter's bold strokes merged with the boy's delicate lines. Their latest creation showed a family of 4, holding hands under a sky full of stars. "Look at this," the wife said one evening, pulling out his therapy journal. The therapist had been documenting his progress through pictures. The first drawings showed a small figure alone in a corner. But over months, the pictures changed. Now they showed 4 figures, always together, always smiling. The therapist noted how his use of color had evolved from dark blues to bright yellows and warm oranges. The husband compiled videos showing their daily life. Clips of the boy helping to bake cookies, carefully measuring ingredients without being asked. Moments of him teaching the family dog new tricks through gentle gestures and patient repetition. Scenes of quiet evenings where all four of them worked on puzzles together, communicating through subtle nods and understanding smiles. But not every document told a happy story. There were concerned letters from distant relatives who didn't understand. How can you be sure about a child who doesn't speak? They wrote. What if he has deeper problems you don't know about? The parents filed these letters away without response, knowing that some people measure love in words rather than actions. The daughter contributed her own statement to the application. She wrote about their special morning routine, how they had developed their own sign language, and how she had never felt more understood than in their silent conversations. Some people think you need words to be a family, she wrote, but we know better. The hardest part was explaining to the adoption committee why they were so certain. How do you put into words the way he left paper hearts on their pillows every Sunday? How do you describe the gentle way he helped smaller kids at school, or how he seemed to know exactly when someone needed a hug? Their application grew thicker with letters of support. The school principal wrote about how the boy had changed their understanding of communication, inspiring them to start a sign language club. His art teacher sent photos of his paintings, pointing out how they showed emotional depth beyond his years. Even their elderly neighbor wrote about how the boy always noticed when her newspaper hadn't been picked up, delivering it to her door without being asked. One evening, as they were finishing the last of the paperwork, the boy appeared with his own contribution. It was a carefully drawn picture book, showing their family's story from his perspective. The final page showed all of them standing in front of a judge, with one word carefully printed at the bottom: forever. The wife hung that picture right by the front door, where everyone could see it. The husband added it to their application file, right on top. Sometimes, the most important statements don't need words at all. They submitted everything on a sunny Thursday morning, the whole family walking to the post office together. The boy held the heavy envelope carefully, like it contained all their dreams. In a way, it did. None of them knew then that this was just the beginning of their journey, that the biggest challenge and miracle was still to come. Back home, they celebrated with ice cream sundaes for dinner, breaking all the usual rules. As they sat around the kitchen table, making up silly gestures for different ice cream toppings, they felt like they could handle whatever came next. They were already a family. The papers would just make it official. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, mixed in with grocery store flyers and electric bills. The wife's hands trembled as she read it, coffee forgotten on the counter. 2 weeks before their final court date, everything was about to change. A biological aunt, she whispered to her husband that evening, after the children were asleep. She says she's been searching for him all this time. The kitchen, usually warm and welcoming, felt suddenly cold. They'd known this was always possible, but after 6 years of silence, it had seemed so unlikely. The aunt's claim hit their world like a thunderstorm. She had documentation, old family photos, birth records, stories about his early years. She spoke of family traditions, shared blood, and rights that went beyond paper and ink. Each word in her legal letter felt like a brick wall being built between them and their boy. The daughter found out the next morning when she noticed both parents looking worried over their untouched breakfast. The boy, sensitive as always to the family's emotions, kept glancing between them, his fingers nervously tapping out their secret code for what's wrong. That afternoon, their living room filled with people trying to help. Their lawyer spoke in gentle tones about legal rights and procedures. The social worker who had been with them since the beginning brought out old files, searching for any information they might have missed about the boy's background. The aunt's story was compelling. She spoke of searching across 3 states, following dead-end leads and false hopes. She had newspaper clippings about the day the boy was found, carefully preserved in plastic sheets. Her lawyer argued that family ties should take precedence, that blood connections couldn't be ignored. But the boy's reaction to the news told its own story. When shown a photo of his aunt, he didn't show any sign of recognition. Instead, he clutched his current family photo, the one where they were all making silly faces at the camera, and refused to let it go. That night, he slept on the floor of his sister's room, their hands linked even in sleep. The parents stayed up late every night that week, researching similar cases, talking to experts, building their defense. Their kitchen table disappeared under stacks of papers. Proof of doctor's appointments they'd taken him to, report cards showing his progress, photographs documenting every milestone they'd shared. The aunt requested supervised visits. The first meeting was set up at a family service center, with social workers present. The boy sat stiffly in his chair, his usual warmth replaced by a stillness they hadn't seen since his early days at the foster center. When the aunt tried to hug him, he backed away, moving closer to his foster sister instead. Friends and neighbors rallied around them. Their elderly neighbor brought over casseroles, saying nobody could think straight on an empty stomach. The boy's art teacher sent a portfolio of his work, showing through pictures how he had blossomed in their care. Even his silent progress told a story, from dark, isolated figures to bright family scenes full of joy. The hardest part was explaining everything to the children. The daughter became fiercely protective, refusing to leave her brother's side at school. The boy started drawing again, but his pictures changed. Now they showed doors, lots of them, all closed. Except for one, which always had their family on the other side. Their lawyer advised them to prepare for a difficult hearing. The judge will want to know what's best for the child, she explained. We need to show not just that you've taken good care of him, but that moving him now would cause real harm. That night, they sat together in the boy's reading nook, surrounded by the glow-in-the-dark stars they'd put up together. The daughter taught him a new sign. Fingers crossed over the heart, meaning forever family. As they watched him repeat the gesture, they made a silent promise. They would fight for him, not because they wanted to win, but because sometimes love creates its own kind of truth. None of them could have guessed that in just a few days, in a quiet courtroom, this silent boy would find his voice in the most unexpected way. But for now, they held each other close, their family bound together by something stronger than blood. The choice to love, the decision to stay, the courage to fight for what matters most. The courthouse looked bigger than usual that Wednesday morning, its stone steps stretching up like a mountain to climb. The boy held both his foster parents' hands as they walked up, his grip tighter than ever before. His sister walked close behind, carrying his favorite blue backpack filled with his drawing supplies, just in case. They'd arrived early, but the hallway was already crowded. Their lawyer stood near the courtroom doors, talking quietly with the social worker who had known the boy since his first day at Hope Haven. Both women smiled encouragingly, though worry lines creased their foreheads. The boy's aunt sat on a bench across the hall, dressed in a neat black suit. She kept looking their way, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and determination. Next to her, her lawyer shuffled through papers, occasionally whispering in her ear. The tension in the air felt thick enough to touch. Inside the courtroom, morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, creating patterns on the wooden floors. The boy looked around with wide eyes, taking in the high ceilings, the heavy wooden benches, the flags standing silent in the corners. His foster mother noticed how he kept touching the pocket where he had tucked their family photo. The family sat together on the right side of the courtroom. Friends from their neighborhood filled the benches behind them. The elderly neighbor who always saved cookies for the boy, his art teacher who had written glowing letters of support, even the mail carrier who had watched him grow over the past year. On the other side sat the aunt and a few people who looked like her, perhaps other relatives who had just discovered the boy's existence. They whispered among themselves, occasionally pointing to a thick folder of documents they had brought. The judge's entrance silenced everyone. She was an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes behind serious-looking glasses. As she settled into her chair, she looked around the courtroom carefully, her gaze lingering on the boy for a moment. The hearing began with the aunt's lawyer presenting their case. He showed old family photos, birth certificates, and spoke about family heritage and blood ties. He talked about how the aunt had never stopped searching, how she had followed every possible lead for 6 years. His words painted a picture of family rights and biological connections that seemed hard to argue against. The boy's foster parents' lawyer spoke next. Instead of just showing documents, she told their story through evidence of love. She presented the boy's artwork showing his journey from darkness to light. She shared reports from his teachers about his progress, notes from his therapist about his emotional growth, and photographs of countless small moments that made up their family life. Throughout all of this, the boy sat quietly between his foster parents, his hand never leaving his sister's. He watched everything with those observant eyes that had seen so much in his young life. When his aunt dabbed at tears while talking about missing his early years, he pressed closer to his foster mother. When his foster father's voice cracked while describing their morning routines, he squeezed his hand tighter. The social worker's testimony seemed especially powerful. She described how the boy had transformed from a withdrawn child who hid from the world into someone who now helped younger kids at school tie their shoelaces. She explained how his selective mutism wasn't just about not speaking. It was about trust, safety, and finding his own way to connect with the world. As the morning wore on, both sides presented more evidence. The aunt's lawyer argued about the importance of cultural heritage and family history. The foster parents' lawyer spoke about stability, emotional bonds, and the family they had already become. The judge listened to everything carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking questions that showed she understood the complexity of the situation. But no one could have predicted what would happen next when she asked if anyone had any final statements to make. No one expected that this silent boy, who hadn't spoken a word in 6 years, would be the one to stand up and change everything. Looking back later, people would say you could have heard a pin drop in that moment. The boy's small movement as he stood drew every eye in the room. His foster family held their breath, while his aunt leaned forward in her seat. The judge's kind eyes met his and waited for what would come next. Time seemed to slow down in the courtroom. The boy's small feet made no sound as he walked to the center of the room. His foster sister half rose from her seat, ready to follow, but her mother gently touched her arm. This was his moment. The judge leaned forward slightly, her glasses catching the morning light. She had seen thousands of cases in this courtroom, but something about this boy's quiet determination made her set down her pen and give him her full attention. The boy stood straight and tall, though his hands trembled slightly at his sides. He looked different somehow, no longer the silent child who hid in corners, but someone who had something important to say. His blue sweater, carefully ironed that morning by his foster father, made his eyes seem brighter than usual. His aunt watched from her seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had brought old baby pictures to court, trying to prove their connection. But now, seeing him stand there, she realized how much of his life she had missed. He wasn't the toddler in those faded photographs anymore. The social worker who had known him since the beginning pressed her hand to her mouth. She remembered his first day at Hope Haven, how he had curled into himself, refusing to look at anyone. The contrast between that frightened child and this brave boy standing before the court brought tears to her eyes. The boy's foster parents sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. They had never pushed him to speak, understanding that silence can be a kind of safety. Their daughter gripped her mother's hands so tight it almost hurt, but nobody moved to break that connection. For a moment, the boy looked back at his foster family. His eyes met his sister's first, she who had taught him to communicate without words, who had shown him that family could be built choice by choice, day by day. Then he looked at his foster parents, who had given him space to heal while never letting him doubt their love. Finally, he turned to face the judge. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Everyone waited, wondering if he would use the sign language he had created with his sister, or perhaps point to something he had drawn. Instead, he opened his mouth. The sound that came out was quiet but clear, like a bell ringing in the morning air. One word. Just one. But it was enough to change everything. Home. The word hung in the air like a prayer. Some people later said they weren't sure they had heard it at first, it was so soft. But there was no mistaking what happened next. The boy turned and pointed to his foster family, his hand steady and sure. His foster mother covered her face with her hands, tears streaming between her fingers. His foster father stood up without realizing it, then sat back down heavily. Their daughter was beaming through her own tears, making their special sign for brave over and over. The aunt's lawyer shuffled his papers, suddenly uncertain. The aunt herself sat very still, watching the boy with new understanding in her eyes. Sometimes love isn't about what you want to hold onto, but what you need to let go. The social worker was openly crying now, but smiling too. 6 years of silence, broken by the perfect word at the perfect moment. In all her years of working with children, she had never seen anything quite like this. The judge removed her glasses slowly, using the moment to compose herself. In her long career, she had learned that sometimes the quietest voices speak the most truth. She looked at the boy, still standing tall in the center of her courtroom, and saw something that all the legal documents in the world couldn't show: the wisdom of a child's heart. Nobody in that courtroom would ever forget that moment. It wasn't just about a single word breaking 6 years of silence. It was about a little boy who had found his voice when it mattered most, who knew exactly what he needed to say and when he needed to say it. And it wasn't over yet, because sometimes, when the right word breaks the silence, it opens the door for more to follow. The courtroom remained silent after the boy's word, as if everyone was holding their breath. The judge sat very still, her silver hair catching the sunlight streaming through the high windows. Then she did something that surprised everyone. She took off her black robe. "I need to tell you all a story," she said, her voice gentle but clear. She stepped down from her high bench, moving to sit in a regular chair closer to the boy. The formal atmosphere of the courtroom shifted, becoming somehow more human, more real. 30 years ago, she began, "I was sitting where you are." She looked at the boy, who had returned to his seat between his foster parents, but was watching her intently. "I was 7 years old, wearing my best dress, holding my teddy bear so tight its stuffing was coming loose." The judge's hands trembled slightly as she opened a small locket she wore around her neck. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a little girl with braids, sitting on the steps of this very courthouse. "My foster parents were teachers," she continued. "They had given me a home when nobody else would. They taught me to love books, to believe in myself, to trust again." She paused, looking around the courtroom. The aunt was leaning forward, her earlier determination softened by something new in her eyes. The foster sister had stopped crying and was listening with her whole body, the way children do when they know they're hearing something important. "Back then, people didn't always understand that family isn't just about blood," the judge went on. "They didn't see how love could be stronger than genetics, how trust could matter more than tradition. But I knew, just like this brave boy knows, exactly where my home was." She stood up and walked to where the boy sat. "When I spoke in court that day, I only said one word too. Mine was please." She smiled, and for a moment, everyone could see the little girl she had once been, sitting in her own courtroom, fighting her own voice. The boy's foster mother was crying softly now, happy tears that she didn't try to hide. The foster father had his arm around both children, holding them close. Their daughter was making their special sign for love over and over, like a heartbeat. The judge returned to her chair, but she didn't put her robe back on. Instead, she pulled out a small, worn notebook from her desk. "I've kept this since my own adoption day," she explained. "It reminds me that sometimes the most important decisions aren't about laws and papers. They're about listening to the quiet voices that speak the loudest truths." She looked directly at the aunt now, whose eyes were also wet with tears. "Your love for your nephew was clear," she said kindly. "Your search for him shows how much you care. But sometimes loving someone means understanding where they belong, even if that place isn't with us." The aunt nodded slowly, understanding filling her face. She looked at the boy, really looked at him, not as the baby she had lost, but as the child he had become. She saw how he leaned into his foster mother's embrace, how his sister's hand fit perfectly in his, how his foster father's gentle presence seemed to give him strength. The judge picked up her pen, but before she wrote anything, she asked the boy one question. "Is there anything else you want to say?" Everyone expected him to stay silent, to let his one powerful word stand alone. But the boy surprised them again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing he had made that morning, two families connected by a bridge of stars, with enough love to reach across any distance. The judge smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. Sometimes the best families aren't the ones we're born into, but the ones we choose. And sometimes the quietest children have the wisest hearts. As she began to write her decision, sunlight streamed through the windows, turning the ordinary courtroom into something magical. It was as if the whole room was holding its breath, waiting for her words to make official what everyone's hearts already knew. The judge's pen moved across the paper with purpose, making official what love had already decided. When she looked up, her smile reached all the way to her eyes. "The adoption is approved," she announced, her voice warm and certain. But she wasn't finished yet. Looking at the aunt, whose eyes were still wet with tears, the judge added something unexpected. "And I'm adding a special provision," she said. "Monthly visits, if everyone agrees. Because a child can never have too many people who love them." The boy, who had been holding his breath, suddenly stood up. Everyone watched, wondering if he would speak again. Instead, he did something even more remarkable. He walked over to his aunt and gave her a small hug. It was brief but real, a bridge between past and future. His sister jumped up next, unable to contain herself any longer. She rushed to him, their special signs flying between them faster than anyone could follow. "We're official," her hand said. "Forever family," his fingers replied. Their parents weren't far behind, wrapping both children in a group hug that said more than words ever could. The elderly neighbor who had been sitting in the back row burst into happy tears, already planning the celebration cake she would bake. The social worker was beaming, her case notes forgotten in her lap as she watched 6 years of work bloom into something beautiful. Outside the courtroom, the afternoon sun turned everything golden. The boy looked different somehow, taller, more confident, as if speaking that one word had helped him grow. He kept touching the judge's signature on the papers, his fingers gentle against the fresh ink. That's when he surprised everyone one more time. Standing on the courthouse steps, surrounded by the people who had become his family, he tugged on his father's sleeve. When everyone turned to look at him, he spoke again, his voice small but clear. "Can we get ice cream now?" The laughter that followed was pure joy. His sister hugged him so hard they almost fell down the steps. His mother couldn't stop crying and smiling at the same time. His father just kept saying, "Yes, yes, yes," over and over, as if he was answering more than just the ice cream question. The aunt joined them for ice cream, bringing a small photo album she had brought to court. As the children explored their sundaes, she showed the family pictures of the boy as a baby. Instead of being painful, it felt right, like adding more chapters to the beginning of his story. At the ice cream shop, other customers smiled at the happy group, not knowing they were watching a miracle. The boy tried every flavor he could reach, as if making up for all the ice cream celebrations they hadn't had yet. His sister taught him their special sign for brain freeze, making everyone laugh again. That evening, back at home, the boy did something he'd never done before. He went to each family member and said, "Good night," out loud. The words were still quiet, still a little unsure, but they were there. His sister nearly fell out of bed in surprise. His mother had to sit down. His father just glowed with pride. The last thing he did before going to bed was add to the family photo wall. Next to all their other pictures, he put up his drawing from court, the one with two families connected by stars. Under it, in careful handwriting, he wrote his first complete sentence: "Love makes us family." Later that night, his parents stood in his doorway, watching him sleep. The moonlight through his window cast star-shaped shadows on his peaceful face. His sister had fallen asleep in the reading chair next to his bed, still wearing her best big sister shirt that she'd made specially for court. "He'll talk more when he's ready," his father whispered. "He already says everything important," his mother replied. And they were both right. Because sometimes the quietest stories have the loudest hearts, and sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, one silent moment at a time. The judge's special notebook gained a new entry that night. Under the story of her own adoption day, she wrote about a brave boy who proved that one word, spoken from the heart, can build a bridge strong enough for everyone to cross.